All right, so I think we can now start. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are on the planet, and welcome to this webinar. So I will maybe start by quickly introducing myself. I am Thomas Aristias. I work as the desk officer for climate security at the General Directorate for International Relations and Strategy of the Ministry for the Armed Forces. And I supervise, among other activities, the Observatory on Defense and Climate, which was launched in 2016 by the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs, and which is financed by our ministry. So for those of you who are discovering the observatory, basically its goals are to better understand the correlations between climate change and conflicts, to better understand also the impacts of climate change on our operations and missions, and of course to anticipate these risks in order to be able to adapt to them in the best way possible. So today we are here with our trusted partners and friends from India and from Australia to discuss and exchange on the security implications of climate change in the Indian Ocean. So let me welcome our speakers today and introduce them. So first, François GEMMENE, who is going to be our chair today. So he heads the Observatory on Defense and Climate jointly with Julia Tass. He is a specialist of environmental geopolitics and migration dynamics. He is also a FNRS senior research at the University of Liège, Belgium, where he is the director of the Hugo Observatory. Julia Tass is a research fellow at IRIS, where she heads the Energy and Climate Program, and she is the co-director with François of the Observatory on Defense and Climate. Her research focuses on the ocean, security and climate nexus from a geopolitical perspective. Then on the Indian side, we have the pleasure to welcome Vice Admiral Pradeep CHAUHAN, who is the general manager of the National Maritime Foundation in Delhi, and who served 4 decades in the executive branch of the Indian Navy. We also have Dr. Pushp Bajaj, who is an associate fellow at the National Maritime Foundation, and his work focuses on climate change impacts on maritime security, climate change mitigation and adaptation, sustainability in the maritime domain, and foreign relations implications of climate change. Then on the Australian side, we have Dr. Anthony BERGIN, senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and whose expertise includes maritime security, oceans policy, homeland security, disaster resilience, South Pacific, Antarctica, and of course, climate security. And then we have Dr. David Brewster, who is a senior research fellow with the National Security College, Australian National University, where he works on the Indian Ocean and Indo-Pacific maritime security. So I will now leave the floor to François for the next part.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, wherever you are located, and thanks for joining us for this seminar that will explore the security implications of climate change in the Indian Ocean, and in particular, we'll try to see what are the ways for cooperation, for greater collaboration between France, India, and Australia on these issues. Over the past few years, now we've organized a series of seminars convening different stakeholders with the goal of mapping these different risks. So I will first yield the floor to Julia Tass so that she can basically introduce us to some of the key conclusions and recommendations of this mapping of the risk in the Indian Ocean, and then we'll move to the roundtable where we'll hear from Australia and India about diverse perspectives on these security impacts of climate change. And then in the discussion, we'll try to design together some possible avenues for cooperation, hopefully that will stimulate an even greater collaboration between our 3 countries. So without further ado, let me now yield the floor to Julia Tass. She's heading the Energy and Climate Security Program at IRIS, which is a French think specialized in international relations, and she's also the co-director, along with myself, of the Observatory on Climate and Defense set up by the Ministry of Armed Forces. Thank you, Julia. So please run us through the key conclusions and recommendations of this exercise of risk mapping in the Indian Ocean.
Thank you, François. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm not going to be quite too long because I want to leave the time for discussion around the recommendation that we produced. But to come back quickly on the report that we wrote in 2020. So at the Observatory, we had in charge the writing of a report mapping environmental and climate risk with regards to security in the western part of the Indian Ocean. And that report complemented a report written in 2019 on the same risk, but in the eastern part of the Indian Ocean. And so what we came up with was that cooperation is key in tackling the climate change impact in terms of security and defense. Indeed, climate change is a global phenomenon, and we need to cooperate in order to address it. So what we came up with was were different ways of cooperation, different avenues, as François said. So first, we can come back to one of the main points we highlighted, and it was data sharing. There is need for better data sharing between different countries, whether it be for climate science or marine sciences, in order to know better the environment that armed forces will have to operate in. And in that perspective, we suggested to enable the Indian Ocean to benefit from the experience of the Pacific Environmental Security Forum and to get inspired by such practices. We also considered data sharing as a key asset for maritime safety and maritime surveillance. And I will let our speakers and panelists maybe discuss about that in a deeper conversation. But so data sharing is the first pillar of cooperation according to our recommendation. The second one would be capacity building. Capacity building in terms of maritime domain awareness, as well as port state control and surveillance and control of exclusive economic zone. That could different ways are suggested to enable capacity building or to facilitate capacity building. And among other, we offered to strengthen the regional maritime information fusion center in Madagascar, and to facilitate the exchange of this fusion center with those in New Delhi and Singapore. And finally, another way to cooperate would be military cooperation. And in this military cooperation, we consider that military cooperation for HADR, so post-disaster intervention, is key. So first would be to strengthen interoperability of the different armies when it comes to post-disaster intervention, and to tackle as well IUU fishing. Not to take too much time on that topic, one of the conclusions of our report was that IUU fishing could be considered as one of the main risks with regards to climate change impact and security in the Indian Ocean. And we fear that the increase of IUU fishing practices in the Indian Ocean could lead to more conflicting situations and tensions. And before leaving the floor to the rest of the panel, I would just underline the importance of ensuring the resilience of key infrastructures in the Indian Ocean. So that could be done through sharing experiences and best practices in terms of assessing critical infrastructure vulnerability to climate change, as well as also addressing key regulatory weaknesses as for undersea cables. So as you might know, undersea cables are key for the connection of small islands in the Indian Ocean. And they're also quite exposed to environmental as well as human-made security implications. And there is a gap in the regulatory environment around these undersea cables, as well as globally, making sure that they are safe or that there are enough undersea cables to provide all small islands with strong and stable internet connections. So with that different recommendation in mind, what we are very happy to have this this webinar today, because that's really the first step discussing this different conclusion and maybe strengthening cooperation around those different topics. I will get back the floor to François GEMMENE and cut my camera so that we can welcome the last speaker and enable him to present later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this short presentation. Before we step into the roundtable, a few practical and logistical details for those of you attending. First, I want to let you know that you should be able to download the documents that Julia was referring to in her presentation. If you go to your configuration panel and if you look at the item documents to share, or if you have the panel in French, documents à distribuer, you should be able to find the 3 documents that Julia was referring to. These documents are free and available to all, so you should feel free to download them. I also want to tell you all online, and you're close to 100 following us online, that if you'd like to address some questions to our panelists, you can start typing them down already now in the questions panel. I will have access to these questions and I will start allocating them to the speakers as they come in. So don't hesitate to start asking your questions right now already so that we can engage in the discussion immediately after the presentations. For now, as I said, to introduce the roundtable, we'll hear from Australian and Indian perspectives, and we're lucky to be joined by 4 prominent speakers on these issues. I will first yield the floor to Anthony BERGIN. We've worked with Anthony on a number of workshops and reports. He's a senior fellow with ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, and he will guide us through the part of the work that we did with them on the side of the Indian Ocean that is closer to Australia, that is the eastern part. So Anthony, the floor is yours for about 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Francois. I led the Australian side of a study that grew out of a visit by the French president to Australia that requested an environmental mapping exercise of the Indian Ocean and the Southern Ocean. And I will confine my remarks to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, our findings, and David Brewster, who led the Eastern Indian Ocean, as Francois said. His side did the west, our side did the eastern side of the Indian Ocean. But let me summarize the findings as they relate to the Southern Ocean and Antarctica. And in terms of minor threats that we identified, the first was around changes to Antarctic tourism. What we found was the impact of climate change would make much more areas of Antarctica accessible to tourists. There are now 20 polar expedition vessels under construction, in addition to the 33 tourism vessels operating in that part of the Indian Ocean now. China is set to displace the United States as the principal source of visitors to Antarctica. And of course, with new tourism visits, cruise ship vessels, that's also going to mean greater accidents in that body of waters, and I'll come back to that. The second issue on climate change that we identified related to geoengineering proposals, and we identified that artificial iron fertilization is at present the only realistic geoengineering proposal for the Southern Ocean, but we found that there were many uncertainties and unknowns relating to the effects of iron fertilization The third issue that we looked at in terms of minor threats was the harvesting of icebergs. Now, a number of countries, including Saudi Arabia, the UAE, South Africa, have done serious investigations in looking at how to harvest icebergs for utilising for obviously for fresh water. There are economic, logistic challenges to the harvesting of icebergs. I'd simply note that that ice is not identified as a mineral in the Antarctic Environmental Protocol. So the possibility of harvesting icebergs we found was certainly there. The next issue was the potential resumption of whaling that we identified, with some traditional whaling states may resume whaling. And what we also found was that that also increases, apart from the ecosystem effects, the impact on search and rescue and maritime safety, because in the past, a whole range of environmental
Anthony, you seem to be cut off, at least on my side. I suspect it's the same for everyone. Anthony, can you hear us? Well, maybe Vice Admiral CHAUHAN, you might want to step in, and we'll try to get back with Anthony. I'll draw him a quick private message or email, and we'll try to get him back online. But if you don't mind to step in, thank you very much. You're the Director General of the National Maritime Foundation, which is one of the leading research institutes in India on those issues. So please, the floor is yours, and I hope we'll manage to get back with Anthony BERGIN in a few moments.
Thank you for the correction of the title. I was a bit awkwardly placed being the general manager. So unless Tom knows something more about my career than I do. With that, I am sharing my screen. Please indicate whether you can see the screen on your side.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
All right. So I'm going to, over the next 10 minutes, rush through some of the issues that are relevant to us. I am aware that much has been covered already. So I'm not going to dwell on any of the slides that indicate basics. For example, this one. These 5 climate certainties are now taken for granted, and including in the United States of America. Well, when we focus upon the Indian Ocean, we find that the map of the Indian Ocean, it predominates much of our discussion and the geographic orientation of this particular body of water. Importantly, in parts of the Indian Ocean region, there are very large numbers of weak and often callous governance mechanisms. And here, even a relatively small climatic shift can trigger or exacerbate food shortages, water security, destructive weather events, the spread of disease, most importantly, human migration and natural resource competition. We're all aware of the increasing temperatures and the correlation between greenhouse gases and the temperature rise. I don't think that this slide needs any elaboration. I do want to emphasize that as a result of heat and water stress, we in India and in South Asia in general suffer somewhat grievously. 54% of India faces high to extremely high water stress, and this is not bettered by much of the remaining segments of the area, as you can see from this particular map. So we think that increasing water scarcity is going to contribute to instability everywhere, and it will also add to the pressures of migration. Water scarcity also shapes the geopolitical order when states engage in direct competition with their neighbors over these shrinking water supplies. This map shows you the in this river, and the treaty that exists on this count between India and Pakistan, and this also is a source of geopolitical tension. If you take the increase of extreme weather events, this slide indicates the number of extreme weather events that have occurred in just the last year, which we have just completed, and adding to the woes of COVID-19 are all the facts that we have got a number of cyclones that are increasing in frequency, they are increasing in ferocity, and they are decreasing in their path predictability. So how does this impact everything? For example, if you look at the locust swarms that wiped out much of Indian agriculture last year, these occurred because of the number of cyclones that the 2 or 3 cyclones that actually hit the Oman coast and generated locust swarms which would have otherwise not had the nourishment that they needed. And these vast locust swarms then moved across into Pakistan and from there also into northwestern India, devastating much of our crop. That means that the pressure on fishing as the alternative source for food security increases, and then that means that IUU fishing picks up automatically. So this graph, of course, is well known. It's set to show you that there is a sharp rise between 2019 2020 in the number of high-intensity storms and the damage that they cause. If you look at sea level rise, this is of particular concern to all of us because this graph, which is now relatively up to date, actually shows an extremely worrying trend in the Indian Ocean, more so than anywhere else. And India is the 5th most vulnerable country to the adverse impacts of climate change in general, and is in the top 3 where sea level rise is concerned. This is a really scary map, and this is a map of 2050, which is right now being put out by a think tank in Germany, and they're using the LIDAR methodology to actually produce this map, and you can see the amount of inundation that Mumbai will suffer. And in case you think that it's only on the west coast, we have, of course, Kolkata on the east coast suffering equally grievously. So climate change in general and sea level rise in particular are major threats that our militaries are concerned about. Even at the geopolitical level, if you look at this map of the Maldives, we have a population, an actual population of about 450,000 Maldivians, and if sea level rise occurs at the rate it's going, then very shortly we will have 400 and something 50,000 boat people. And the question is, where will they go? I don't know. Maybe they'll go to Sri Lanka. Then where will the Sri Lankans go? And so clearly we have a geopolitical problem in the offing that we must worry about. If you look at the deltaic regions of the South Asian continent, the situation is not much better there either. If you look at Bangladesh, in our lifetimes, Bangladesh is likely to lose between 20 to 40% of its coastline. And that means that there are a series of impacts that affect the security concerns of navies, of countries, of nationalities, and of cooperative mechanisms such as the one we are seeking to build. This is the similar inundation map by 2050 of the capital city of Dhaka in Bangladesh. All that orange stuff is where we're going to have seawater flooding on a regular basis. Disputes, then, when the coastline recedes, it will transgress all the limits that have been imposed by various thinking organizations within the legal structures. And what will then happen to the baselines? Will the baselines recede, or will there be internal waters of the order of 40 nautical miles or 50 nautical miles, or in this case, at 1.5 meter rise, you will have more than 100 nautical miles of internal waters. That's clearly untenable. Baselines will have to be revised. If the baselines get revised, what happens to the outer limits of those baselines? Then what happens to ICLOS? And we need to have many issues that are many studies that are concentrating upon such issues. The salinization of water is well known. I won't dwell upon this particular slide, except to tell you that as saline intrusion increases as a consequence of sea level rise, we're going to have human migration of a scale that was last seen in the Indian subcontinent in 1971, where we had about 10 million Bangladeshi refugees crossing over into India. And where in India will these come? These people will all line up in what is already called the Red Corridor, where we have a lack of total governance, not a total lack of governance, but a lack of total governance, and there are weaknesses in this area as well. So we did a study on the perspectives of climate change and its relationship to state failure, because if state failures start to occur, then our security issues are going to go completely out of hand and spiral. And therefore, I thought I would show you this slide, which is work in progress that we are now establishing. We've got primary impacts and primary risks from climate change, their impact upon the primary impact points, and then the secondary impacts that are taking place already in some areas, and the risk of all this needs to now be mapped. So the fact that we can say this is great, but how much? What is exactly happening? Who's doing the measurement? Are we exchanging measurements? And so if we have a collapse of the industrial economy, a collapse of the agricultural economy, and a loss of livelihood, then that will exacerbate, if not lead to, new migrations and create vast amounts of socio-political unrest. That will lead to the rise of violent extremism, and then that will cascade into state failure. So I'll be happy to share these slides with you at the end of this. I only wanted to mention that there are a large number of naval impacts and mission impacts also which arise out of this. As you can see, the strain upon naval forces to respond, to be the first responders in maritime related humanitarian assistance and disaster relief operations will put a strain on everybody's resources. We need to find some structures by which we can even out this strain. And the area that we're talking about is, of course, enormous. So there will be vulnerabilities of naval coastal installations. We are engaged in a project on quantifying those in India. I'm sure that there are methodologies which are being worked out in Australia and in France. And clearly we have a demand for establishing more intensive and extensive international maritime partnerships. Although the United States has put out a report saying that there are no first-order impacts on anti-submarine warfare operations, but the fact is that there are areas of the ocean that are getting saltier and therefore changing the sound profiles, and that will impact both submarine and anti-submarine operations. The impacts on coastal infrastructure have already been mentioned. I only wanted to say that as a result, there are a number of things that we need to do. And of these number of things, I thought I would highlight these 5 that are on your screen. The fifth one says that we need to commission detailed studies, the ASPI, the NMF, the IRIS in France, etc. And so every organizational structure that we have, and these are my last point, that every organizational structure we have must cater for a conceptual structure. And in this case, I think that the SAGAR and the Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative is a conceptual structure. We need a political structure, and in that political structure, surely this is IORA and IORA Plus. And since France is now, by the way, many congratulations for becoming a member full-fledged of the IORA, there is a clear political ability now to engage more directly. But at the end of the day, ladies and gentlemen, someone has to, and that someone will always be naval forces. And so I think that the executive structure is typified by the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, which once again has the 3 countries that are engaged today in it. And with that, I will draw my remarks to a close, and hoping that you will have found them to be of marginal interest and that we can discuss them a bit later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral. That was really enlightening. Thanks also for guiding us through the organizational structure of this in India. Before we move to Pushp, Bajaj, and also to the questions and answers and comments, I want to give the floor to Anthony again, because Anthony was disconnected during his presentation. So hopefully he'll be able to finish the presentation right now, and the connection will be more stable. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you, François. So I was talking about when I dropped out, some of the pressures on the Antarctic Treaty with the growth of new members, going from the original 12 countries now to 29, the incredible growth of the number of research stations operating on the cold continent. So with that, expansion has become a real challenge to the management of the Antarctic and the Southern Ocean, and a number of countries have been challenging the very consensus model of decision making. The next issue that we identified under was the increased danger of search and rescue, with the increasing marine traffic in the Southern Ocean, new polar tourism vessels, the number of new players, including universities hiring research vessels, wealthy individuals chartering vessels, adventure tourism, and so forth. So all that we identified as creating new risks for maritime search and rescue. The next issue, and I think François referred to IUU fishing, but we certainly identified the displacement of fishing fleets leading to overfishing coming from other parts of the Indian Ocean, and that displacement will really challenge fisheries management in the Southern Ocean. The next issue we identified was the exploitation of krill. Very high catches of krill. It's a growing fishery. It could become one of the top 10 wild caught fisheries in the world. China is currently the only fishing nation for krill in eastern Antarctica, and countries like Russia and China have been challenging marine environmental protection measures in the Southern Ocean because they want to leave that area open to exploiting living marine resources. The next threat we identified was ocean acidification. The Southern Ocean is one of the most vulnerable areas of the world to ocean acidification. And the final threat in the significant risk category was the climate change implications on Antarctic infrastructure and accessibility, issues relating to changing precipitation, changes in the sea ice regime and their flow-on implications for Antarctic access, for Antarctic transport, and so on. And we certainly found that countries will have to better understand the regional impacts of climate change for protecting the infrastructure they do have. In terms of catastrophic threats, and I'll finish on this, we identified three. Firstly was IUU fishing. Many nations consider that Antarctic toothfish are unexploited, and while we found that IUU fishing has declined in Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, we identified the risk that new players would come on the scene. There are already risks associated with transshipment, and we also identified with climate change that there will be shifts in the migration of fisheries, such as tuna, moving into the Southern Ocean, creating its own challenges. The second catastrophic threat was climate change-related marine ecosystem effects. Both the east and the west Antarctic ice sheets are collapsing or are in retreat, and the complexity of those changes is likely to produce unanticipated consequences in the future, including ice shelf collapse and sea level rise. And that will, of course, have further impacts on marine ecosystems. Finally, the third catastrophic category we looked at was the prospects for conflict, war due to occupation of Antarctic territory, and increasing militarization. We certainly thought that the possibility of resource exploitation as resources become scarce elsewhere, and as countries turn their attention to Antarctica, the region may see conflict. But more importantly, what we identified was a greater risk of significant militarization and a range of scientific activity in Antarctica, particularly associated with remote sensing and the deployment of satellites, raised questions about the military applications of civilian science and how indeed the Antarctic countries could verify and inspect that science to ensure that it's conducted for peaceful purposes. So, François, I'll just leave it at that. And as I indicated, David Brewster, who's now joined us, will identify some of these environmental risks in the eastern Indian Ocean. So thank you, François.
Thank you very much, Anthony, and welcome to David Brewster, who has joined us indeed. He will speak last because before him, I want to give the floor to Pushp Bajaj. Pushp, you're an associate fellow on climate change, also with the National Maritime Foundation, and you'll be complementing the Indian perspective that we've heard from the Vice Admiral. So the floor is yours. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much. Before I begin my remarks, I would like to thank the organizers at IRIS for giving me the opportunity to participate in this panel. And I would also like to thank Admiral CHAUHAN and Mr. BERGIN for providing an overview of some of the impacts of climate change in the broad Indian Ocean context and also in the Southern Ocean context. So what I would like to talk about is maybe the one question that is often asked is, what is the timeline on which these impacts will occur and the timeline on which we should act? And I think that's a very important question, and I would like to spend some time to talk more about that and to discuss it in some more detail and put it into the context of the regional security in the IOR. So in order to convey the urgency of the situation, I think we have to keep in mind two things, which I would like to present to the panel and also for the collective discussion with the participants. The first is that in this webinar, we have representation from France and Australia and India, and these are the three, of course, major powers in the Indian Ocean region. However, so these regions, for them, the idea of the timeline and the urgency would be very different from some of the other regions in the Indian Ocean region. So if we are going to talk about regional security, which of course depends on every nation in the region, we have to look at climate change from the perspective of some of the small island developing states in the region or the least developed countries in, let's say, East Africa or West Asia. Because these countries are less equipped to deal with the impacts of climate change. And unfortunately, they also happen to be the places that will see the greatest impacts. So for these nations, climate change is a major imminent security threat. And of course, the changes that occur in these nations will also have significant geopolitical consequences for the broader region. For example, if you look at Sudan and Ethiopia and some of the other nations in East Africa, we see that in recent years they have faced frequent long-lasting droughts, which have been combined with bouts of extreme precipitation, and also, as Admiral CHAUHAN mentioned in his remarks, the locust attacks or the pest attacks, which threatened in the past 3 years. In fact, starting from 2018. They have had a major impact on the food security in these regions. And also looking at the other, some of the other nations like the small island developing states of Maldives and Seychelles, sea level rise poses an existential threat for these, for a large part of the population in these nations. And in addition to, of course, the other challenges that are being exacerbated by climate change, such as freshwater scarcity. So all of these aspects will have consequences for the major powers like India, Australia, and France. And so if we are putting together a regional action plan, then I think that it has to be centered around maintaining stability in the most vulnerable parts of the region. So the urgency should come from there, not necessarily from the impacts that climate change will have on the major powers, but also on the region as a whole, because that's where we have. So the timeline needs to come from there. The second major aspect in this sense is the inherent nature of the response of the climate system. So we know that the changes in the climate system don't happen in a linear fashion. They often happen in accelerating rates and in an exponential fashion. And I think in that there is a large gap between what the climate science is telling us and what the climate policy is doing. So the policy decisions are currently being driven by model-based future projections that are put out by the IPCC, for instance, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And so some of the major impacts of climate change, for example, sea level rise and extreme weather events, our policy are largely driven by these model-based projections. So if you look at sea level rise, the latest IPCC projections suggest that the global mean sea level rise could be anywhere between 0.61 to 1.1 meters by 2100. So the average is around 0.84 meters. And now that number it has a very heavy weight on that number, right? Because that number has huge implications for every coastal nation in the IOR. And that number will determine the nature of our response and the timeline of our response. And that number will determine whether we will have millions of migrants from some of the developing parts of the world. And if you dig a little deeper into that number and into the science of that number, you realize that there is in fact a significant amount of uncertainty associated with this number. And if we consider the major sources of sea level rise, which are, a few years ago, it used to be the thermal expansion of the ocean, but now we are noticing that the melting of Greenland has actually overtaken as the major source of sea level rise, and the Antarctic ice sheet, as Mr. BERGIN mentioned, is also melting at accelerating rates. And we are continuously discovering new processes that are accelerating melt rates of these ice sheets. Just to take one example, if you look at the Greenland ice sheet, in recent years, scientists have noticed huge colonies of microscopic algae that have been observed on the surface of Greenland ice sheet. And these are breeding in the meltwater ponds that are created by surface melting. And the algae particles are dark in color, either black or red or some other dark color, which of course decreases the albedo of the surface, which leads to more melting, which in turn creates conditions that are conducive for more algal blooms to occur, which in turn leads to more melting. So it enters this sort of a feedback loop, which accelerates the melting. And similarly, the same phenomena happens with the soot particles that get deposited on the Greenland ice sheet, which are traveling from some of the wildfires in the Arctic region. Wildfires themselves in the Arctic region are getting more and more common and more extreme because of rising temperatures and dry air conditions. So these soot particles have the same effect as algae particles on the Greenland ice sheet surface. And maybe Mr. BERGIN would go into the details of the accelerating rates of melting in Antarctica, because Antarctica is not only melting from the top, but it's also melting from the below because of the warm water intrusion, warm ocean water intrusion. Now, the reason why I'm mentioning these things is because none of these aspects are actually explicitly included in the global climate models that are used to predict sea level rise, for instance. So that number that we discussed earlier, that 0.84 meter, that actually does not take into account some of these newly discovered phenomena. So I think that's, so in order to understand, in order to put into context the urgency of the situation, we have to go beyond the model-based projections, and we have to go beyond the national interests and look at the region as a whole. So I will stop at this point and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, not just for the presentation, but also for your excellent time management. Let me now pass it on to David Brewster. David is a senior research fellow with the National Security College at ANU, the Australian National University in Canberra. He has also worked on the Australian side of the risk mapping exercise. So please, David, the floor is yours. Don't forget to type in your questions already in the question box so that we can jump straight into the discussion after David's presentation. But for now, David, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot for joining us. Don't forget to click on your mic. David, you're still on mute as of now. I see that you're trying to figure out how to connect the microphone, but there is not much I can do from here in Paris. You might want to try maybe without the earplugs. And normally, David, let me see if I can do something from well, yeah, there's not much I can do. Okay, you're now paused. You should have a microphone icon on your panel. While you're sorting this out, Vice Admiral, I had a question for you, which was about your presentation. Would it be possible to share it? Some participants indeed have asked for the presentation to be shared with them. So if you could send it along, that would be great. And we might even be able to include it in the documents to distribute folder. David, I see you back, which is good news. At least we see you. Hopefully we can hear you as well. And that doesn't seem to be the case, no. At least I cannot hear anything. I don't think that's...
How about now?
Oh, yes, much better. Now it's working.
Okay, my apologies.
No worries, no worries. We had the time to address the small logical issue with the presentation of the Vice Admiral. So David, the floor is yours. Thanks a lot.
Okay, apologies. I'm the IT guy here, so that's what happens. Anthony Bergin's spoken about the Southern Ocean, and I'm going to be talking about the Eastern Indian Ocean, which really encompasses the area from the Australian continent, Southeast Asia, and the Bay of Bengal. And I'll be talking about a few of the reports of our findings from our report in 2019. Obviously, as we're all aware, there's numerous growing environmental security threats in the Indian Ocean, coming from quite a large number of sources. I'm not going to belabor you with a long list of what that includes, but I'll just really focus on three, what I see as key sources of environmental security threat. One is the increase in the severity of tropical cyclones and other severe weather events, rise in sea levels, and thirdly, the decline in fish stocks caused by climate change. Now, Bay of Bengal region in particular has a long history of very severe weather events, and the IPCC predicts that although there will not be likely be an overall increase in the frequency of tropical cyclones, the frequency of the most intense storms are likely to increase substantially. So the Bay of Bengal area in particular is likely to be highly vulnerable to those weather events. That same area, the Bay of Bengal area, is also highly vulnerable to rising sea levels. Obviously, in the Maldives, it represents an existential threat for the country. But moving towards Bangladesh, we see, at least according to a report by the Global Military Advisory Council on Climate Change, a 1 metre rise in sea level would inundate around 17% of Bangladesh's land area, directly affecting 15 million people. And the numbers obviously go up from there. Bangladesh government estimates that some 20 million people will be displaced by climate change in that country, while other studies go higher. The IPCC, I suppose, takes a more cautious approach about the impact of rising sea levels on population movements, and argues that, at least in the short term, population movements are likely to be largely confined domestically. But I would note that with the size of the Bangladesh population as it is, only quite a small percentage of the population needs to move internationally, and it becomes a major issue for all neighbouring states. I wanted to flag also fish stocks. While fish stocks is traditionally seen in the context of illegal fishing, the problems of illegal fishing, I think we should also see it equally as a climate change issue. There are a number of climate change related effects that will impact fish stocks, whether it be due to ocean acidification, marine heat waves, or the development of hypoxic areas, for example. So it's really the combination of legal and illegal fishing, as well as the impact of climate change, which will impact fish stocks. Again, in the Eastern Indian Ocean, there's a very large percentage of the population which are reliant on fish as a major source of their animal protein. So according to the FAO, fish contributed some 54% of total animal protein in Indonesia, for example, as well as being a major contributor to employment. So the disappearance of fish stocks will be a major economic and social disruptor of countries like Indonesia, Bangladesh, and others, which could contribute to other climate change related impacts. I wanted to mention, and this is a point that we made fairly squarely in our report, that we need to see environmental threats beyond just as a single threat, which potentially could be managed alone. They have to be seen as the potential interaction between different events, whether through combination or as a cascading series of events, and also the potential of natural events to be combining with industrial accidents. So, for example, this is not a climate change example, but it is an example of this. The Great Tokyo earthquake in, I believe, 2011 caused tsunamis which destroyed the nuclear plant, and it was a combination of both natural events and industrial accidents which led to disaster. So if we see environmental security threats not just as singular one-off events which can be managed, but potentially as events which can occur in combination and even as a cascading series of events, we should also start thinking about the potential impact of environmental security threats reaching potentially even a geopolitical level of threat. And there's a number of examples of this. the contribution of drought, potentially climate change related drought in Syria, to the civil conflict there. We've seen the impact of the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, again not a climate change but more of a natural hazard, on civil conflicts which then existed in Indonesia and Sri Lanka. Strangely, in Indonesia, basically terminating that civil conflict in Aceh province, while in Sri Lanka doing the opposite, significantly exacerbating the civil conflict in Sri Lanka. And that's a reminder that, I suppose, that how difficult it is to predict the security impact of climate change related events. We can certainly guess at it, but often these events will operate in unexpected ways. Just give me a couple of minutes and I'll mention several recommendations that we've made of practical things that can be done by countries like France, India and Australia to address climate change related threats. One, and this is a bit of a hobby of mine, is the potential for the three countries and other like-minded countries to establish an Indian Ocean Environmental Security Forum, somewhat analogous to the Pacific Environmental Security Partnership that exists in the Pacific Ocean and has operated quite successfully for almost 10 years in bringing together both military and civil agencies right across the region to talk about threats, to develop shared language, shared understandings of the threats, and shared ideas about how to respond to those threats. And certainly in the Pacific Environmental Security Partnership is moving forward to talk about shared responses or collaborative responses to those threats. And I certainly think that there's scope in the Indian Ocean for countries like France, India and Australia, to the three most capable countries in the Indian Ocean to address environmental security threats, to talk about how they can work together and bring in other smaller, less capable countries and work with those as partners. So that's one potential initiative. Another is disaster risk reduction, again drawing from the experience of the Pacific, where the so-called France arrangement, the France, Australia, New Zealand arrangement of sharing resources and collaborating in responding to natural disasters among Pacific islands has been an extremely successful exercise, and certainly there's no reason why Australia, France, India and other countries could not establish a similar standing arrangement in the Indian Ocean. Finally, this is a somewhat related point, among Indian Ocean states, there is certainly a mechanism for cooperation among Indian Ocean navies. There's no dedicated mechanism for cooperation among coast guards in the Indian Ocean. There's HAGM for the heads of Asian coast guards meeting, which encompasses the whole of the Asian littoral, including East Asia. But there's really no dedicated forum to bring together coast guards within the Indian Ocean and particularly insist in cooperation and training of the less capable coast guards. Anyway, so that's three ideas I throw out there in which our three countries could potentially cooperate to address these threats. Thank you, François.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you in particular for outlining three possible avenues for cooperation. We'll now delve directly into the discussion. Julia, my colleague Julia, the co-director of the Observatory on Climate and Defense, will be moderating this. And we have a first question that I wanted to to you to address, which is about the role of China. Is China willing to cooperate with India, France, and Australia on these issues? And how do you see the relationship with China? So I'll let you address that, and over to Julia for the moderation. Thank you, Julia.
Oh, sorry, François, was that a question directed at me?
I think all
Well,
panelists,
to everyone, to anyone who'd like to. We open the floor now. Thank you.
Okay, well, I'll jump in and address it first then.
All right.
I think there's certainly in this area there is potential for cooperation with China, and I think that should certainly not be excluded in any way. We should always be looking for areas of cooperation with China. However, I think that as a matter of timing, I think it's important for key Indian Ocean states to get together, to work together to establish structures. And once those structures are up and running, involving our countries and other Indian Ocean states, then we should be talking about inclusion of extra-regional states such as China. That's my personal view.
we can also address this question to all the other panelists. I invite you to jump in the conversation if you'd like to add something, whether it be on China or on the different points that were presented by the different panelists.
Well, I'd like to. Sorry.
So go ahead, Admiral. Sorry, go.
I just wanted to supplement what David said. I think that we must always find ways in which to constructively engage China. There's no doubt about that. But when we ought to do it, and whether we should do it prematurely right now, or which I think is premature, or we should first consolidate, activities within the region. So we have structures that exist within the region. They are sub-regional, they are pan-regional, they are governmental, they are service specific, and I think that these need to be addressed first. There's also one follow-up point to what David often says about the Coast Guards. And I am always similarly voicing a caveat to that, a caution. And that is that, different Coast Guards are intensely national organizations like navies, but Coast Guards have different jurisdictions of space. And for example, the Kenyan Coast Guard has a jurisdiction of space which is entirely lesser than that of the Indian Coast Guard, and the Indian Coast Guard's jurisdiction is limited to the Indian maritime zones only. And therefore, when you get many Coast Guards involved, you will certainly gain some things, as you would do in any gathering of minds, but the expectation that you might have will need to be tempered a little bit by virtue of the fact that the Coast Guards can exchange information, best practices, but will be unable to actually execute this in operations, whether they are HADR related or search and rescue related, outside of their jurisdictions of space. And since countries have differences, this needs to be borne in mind. Thank you.
It's Anthony Bergin. I'd like to firstly deal with the question of China as it relates to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean. And then I would like to make a comment about Coast Guards and picking up David Brewster's suggestion. On China, I published a report by my institute in April last year, so it's still relatively new, specifically dealing with how Australia manages our relationship with China in Antarctica. China has made significant investments over the last decade in Antarctica. It now has 4 with a bases, with a 5th nearly completed. It's currently constructing a nuclear-powered icebreaker. It's heavily investing in Antarctic science. I suppose the conclusion of my study is encapsulated in the title, which I gave my report, called Eyes Wide Open. And the conclusion was that while I could not find a smoking gun, as it were, in terms of China violating the Antarctic Treaty. What I did find was that China has a very developmental approach to Antarctica and the Southern Ocean, which is really incompatible, I believe, in the long run with interests of countries like Australia, who have essentially an environmental perspective on the continent and the surrounding waters. So my conclusion in answering your question about China is that when it comes to Antarctica, yes, we should cooperate, particularly around climate change research, but we should do it, as I say, with eyes wide open, because I believe that China's longer term interests in Antarctica are incongruent with those of a country like Australia. On the Coast Guard issue, I would just like to endorse what David Brewster said, that there is a gap, I believe, in the Indo-Pacific in terms of a professional development.
Anthony, I think we lost, I don't know for the other panelists, but I can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, we can't hear him either.
Could you try again? Maybe now? I think it's a problem of internet connection rather than a technical problem.
Can you hear me now?
Use your mic and see if that helps, David.
Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
I'll stop.
No,
You
no,
can hear
no,
me.
we can hear you now. Yes, so,
Okay.
yeah,
my simple point is that if you look at the Indo-Pacific, there's no dedicated one-stop shop where Coast Guards can come together, like a military war college, if you like, and that would be the analog. There's no Coast Guard professional development and training centre. I mean, there are a number of Coast Guard academies, but there's no regional Coast Guard centre that could bring Coast Guard leaders from around the region together to discuss many of the issues that we've now been canvassing for the last hour around maritime security and climate.
thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know if Dr. Pushp would like to jump in the conversation and to maybe react to those different points. And after that, I will also open the floor to question from the public. Tom and I will come back to you on that matter.
Yes, thank you. I would just add briefly, I think most of the points have been covered already, but I would just briefly add on the role of China. I think we would all agree that, there's no doubt that China is one of the leading, one of the leading actors in terms of climate change mitigation and adaptation. It possesses the technological and the technological capacity and the human capacity to come up with solutions for climate change. So in that sense, I think the role of China in this regard would certainly be a very important one. But as the other panelists have mentioned, that it has to be, the engagement has to be managed with the other complications of the sort of disregard to the general rules of engagements and the international treaties and so on and so forth. So I think it would be a huge loss if China is not involved in these discussions and in these initiatives, but it has to be balanced out with the other aspects. So I just want to add that.
Thank you very much. Tom, would you like to maybe jump in for questions, whether from the public or from the French side?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I think we have another question, so I'm going to read it for you. So given that the population displacement can be anticipated, is there any possibility for anticipated cooperation to welcome people fleeing climate disasters in their country and partly avoid tensions, or is it utopic? So maybe we can start with David Brewster on these questions.
Thank you, Tom, for giving me the hard question. Well, I think the clear answer is no, other than to the extent that climate refugees would fall under the general UN provisions relating to refugees, but there's certainly no specific provisions, as far as I'm aware, that's been seriously discussed about dealing with climate change refugees. All I can say is that certainly from an Australian perspective, it would be a very difficult conversation to have. Refugees of any, I suppose, of across much of the region, it's a very difficult conversation. So I think it only gives much greater force to the imperative of countries like Australia, together with our regional partners, France and India, to do whatever can be done to mitigate any population movements caused by climate change. Having said that, again, I note that the IPCC, at least the latest report that I saw, remains very cautious about to what extent climate change is likely to trigger large-scale population movements internationally, but obviously there's still a significant risk.
Thank you so much. Maybe Admiral CHAUHAN, you want to build up on this?
Yeah, thank you. It is always an emotive issue, and it runs into huge state sensitivities. Not all states of the Indian Ocean are signatories to the UN conventions on refugees, and yet, India, for example, isn't. But yet India has a very good record of absorbing refugees in very large numbers. And I'm talking about in millions. So to the extent that I think that there are two separate issues here. One of them is, how do you want to approach this if you want to approach it legally and have binding agreements? I think that this is a tall order and you're not going to get anywhere in a hurry. If, on the other hand, you're looking at mechanisms by which you can anticipate these refugees and try and absorb them country by country, in accordance with whatever regulations and empathies might exist outside of regulations in that country, then we have some possibilities. But as David said, this is a very difficult conversation to have. It is up to so many political views. If you take numbers, then I did mention that the total population of the Maldives is actually only about 500 and something thousand, and of them, the actual Maldivian population, the indigenous population, is only about, it's about 100,000 less. So if you're talking about 400,000 people, that's one kind of issue. If you're talking about 5 million people, that's another kind of issue. From the Indian perspective, at least from my personal perspective, I cannot speak for government, but from my personal perspective, I think that the risks are being underplayed, and this is the conversation that will happen. The risk will get underplayed by some countries which do not face this problem as much, and others that will overplay it or will play it up depending on how they see it. For example, heat-based climate refugees, water-stressed climate refugees, existentially threatened climate refugees, politically generated climate refugees are all in different categories of discussion. So if we're talking about small numbers, then I don't think you need a legal structure. If you're talking about big numbers, then I don't think you can have a legal structure. So I think the legal approach is a very, very unpromising one. It might be attractive to the intellectual elites, but it is difficult to implement at the political level. That's my personal opinion. As I said, I don't have any locus standi to speak for my or any other government. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Does anybody want to? Yes, Pushp.
Yes, thank you. Just to add to the categories that Admiral CHAUHAN mentioned on, the types of refugees that we could have originating from heat stress or extreme weather events or sea level rise or any of those factors. There is also the question of internal migration within a nation from coastal regions to the hinterland. And then there is the question of cross-boundary, cross-international boundary migration. So, while we are thinking about regional cooperation in the sense of international migration, the internal migration would also have consequences for the broader region. So, for example, in Bangladesh, if a large part of the coastal population is moving to the capital Dhaka, that puts more pressure on the already populated capital, and that would have spillover effects to, for us in India. So there are these categories, and we have to differentiate between the categories, and they would have different ways of handling with them. There is this concept of managed retreat when you're talking about internal migration within a country, and so if you don't have a plan, the other way that it could go is just chaos. So the plan is absolutely essential in that sense to anticipate and then deal with the huge numbers of migrants. So thank you.
Thank you. Maybe Anthony Bergin, you want to intervene, or can we switch to another question, maybe?
Maybe switch to another question. My only comments would relate. The primary focus of climate refugees for Australia is in the Pacific Ocean. I suspect because many of the small atoll countries in the Pacific are probably the most vulnerable in the world, and there's already islands off the coast of New Guinea, Papua New Guinea, where countries where the population have evacuated in the face of rising sea level. So it will be a practical issue for Australia, but I suspect more in the context of the Pacific Islands, at least in the first instance.
Okay, thank you. So I think we have time for a few more questions. So I have two questions maybe. The first question is something that is mentioned in the French report and the Australian report as well, and it is about the impact of climate change on terrorism and illegal activities. So could you maybe build up and explain to us what are the correlations between climate change and terrorism, or the impact of climate change on illegal activities in the region? And yeah, sorry, the second question is about the place of the United States as a major player in environmental security in the Indian Ocean. I think, David, you mentioned it with the Indian Ocean Environmental Security Forum. So maybe you can start on this.
I'll just say a few quick words around that. I mentioned the Pacific Environmental Security Partnership, which has been going for almost 10 years now, quite successfully under the sponsorship of Indo-PACOM. And so they have driven, there's a secretariat in Hawaii that drives it along with US partners. And there's been really a quite heartening take-up right across the region of all manner of military and civilian agencies, including Chinese PLA, in wanting to talk about climate change. Now, the Indo-PACOM boundary includes India. India has been a little reluctant to participate in the PESP for whatever reason that might be, good or bad, whatever. I think in my discussions with the US military, there is appetite, I think, or interest to see potentially a environmental security arrangement being established for the Indian Ocean. Obviously, it would be quite different from the Pacific in that it would be really incumbent on countries such as India, France and Australia to take the lead out on it, so it'd be quite different. But certainly, in my personal view, I think the United States could play a valuable role in working with like-minded partners. But I think in the Indian Ocean, it's certainly incumbent on the littoral states to take the lead on it.
Anybody else on this? Yeah, sure, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to respond to your first question, Tom, that relates to the connection. I think your question was, what's the connection between climate change and maritime security, or was that the question?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the existing links between climate change and yeah, maritime security, or you know, terrorism more globally, or illegal activities. Sure.
Yeah. Okay, so I think there is a strong connection. Look, in broad terms, climate change, as a number of speakers have said, can potentially impact on people's livelihood, particularly coastal state communities. And, you know, with increased natural disasters overlaid on top of that. So the connection, I believe, relates to the temptation as a result of climate change impacts for people to turn to illegal activities, whether it be smuggling, whether it be illegal fishing, whether it be the movement of narcotics across the sea and so forth. So I think, you know, a number of analysts now are talking about the concept of blue crime. That is crimes associated with the mobility across the ocean, crimes associated with the maritime environment itself. And I think the connection between climate change and blue crime, transnational crime at sea, I think is one that remains unexplored. I mean, there's a lot of emphasis now, of course, on the blue economy, that is developing ocean industries. But in my view, you can't have a blue economy unless you have maritime law and order at sea. And so climate change can impact on maritime law and order at sea, which, as I say, underpins the development of a blue economy. So the connections between climate change, blue crime, and blue economy, I think we need more work on that.
I would like to add something here. That is that, you know, when we talk about the relationship between maritime illegal activities and climate change and its maritime manifestations, we're encompassing a very large range. For instance, I think Adelphi in Germany put out a really good paper indicating the correlation between, for example, the drying up of Lake Chad and the increase in recruitment for Boko Haram. And then the increase of recruitment to Boko Haram led to Boko Haram being wooed by both the then, you know, large terrorist players, that is ISIS and Al-Qaeda. And it was ridiculous, because here was an organization that was gathering more and more people, and the reason they were gathering them is because livelihoods had been disrupted because of the drying or the shrinkage of Lake Chad. then that led to maritime crime increasing, ranging from the low end, which is the smuggling of fuel, and to the high end, which is the amalgamation of this activity to terror. If you look at the rise of ISIS itself, I think that has already been touched upon by Dr. Bajaj when he said that the 4-year entirely predictable drought in the Eastern Mediterranean was still not prepared for. And then that led to huge rural to urban, internal to Syria migration. Then that couldn't be handled because the country hadn't thought about it. And then that led to the very genesis of ISIS. So my point is that at the high end also you have all these issues. So let's talk a little bit about the low end or the middle end and talk about IUU fishing. And if you, for example, see what is happening in terms of the climatic degradation, climate change also involves environmental degradation. And as you start to see the environmental degradation of the close coast areas of Somalia and the related state-based, very frequently state-based illegal activities of simply dumping toxic or noxious wastes into close coast areas led to a sharp decline of fishing, therefore led to the situation as we know it. And then we have the naysayers all the time who tell us that Somalis are not fishermen at all. And this comes as news to many Somalis whom we have met. And they say, I don't know where you're getting your inputs from. And my point is that when we talk about illegal crime at sea and its correlation to climate change, I think we have to appreciate the magnitude of the problem and the range over which these discussions must take place. By corollary, that gives us the opportunity to have many discussions with many stakeholders on areas that are in the beginning comfortable and then move to less comfortable areas thereafter. So it offers huge challenges and it offers huge opportunities at the same time.
Okay, thank you so much. I think the time is running. It's almost 10 already, so I don't think we'll have more time for questions. Maybe François,
Tom, there was just one question in the panel about the role of the EU. Perhaps, and I guess we're better placed to answer that one than our Indian or Australian partners, but we can say a few words about how we see the role of the EU in the region, and then we'll need to come to a conclusion indeed. Do you want to say a few words, or?
Yeah, I think it's really important. The EU has been struggling to be established in the minds of the region as a serious security player in the maritime domain. And there are a number of programs, as you're aware. Primario 2 is a good example of the points that were made by Julia in the beginning about maritime domain awareness and the sharing of information. And although we have a very good IFC running in both Singapore as well as in New Delhi, and there are information sharing centers in the Djibouti Code of Conduct countries and the IOC, but the amount of actual integration is still fairly low. And as a result, the EU's efforts in the South Asian segment of the Indian Ocean is quite remarkable and quite commendable. So at the cost of sounding like this is a plug for the NMF, I really want to say that we are in fact writing what I think is going to be the first book jointly between the EU and the National Maritime Foundation on the EU in the Indian Ocean. And that would be a good idea to sort of dwell upon.
Indeed, thanks for bringing it up. Well, this brings us to a close. I want to thank all the panelists for their interventions and also for the discussion and the different avenues for cooperation. This is certainly not the end of our work in the Indian Ocean, but I want to give the floor maybe to Tom for some words of conclusion.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so thank you so much to everybody. I personally had a terrific time in this webinar, so thank you so much for your very interesting and enlightening interventions, and thank you also to all the participants. So just a quick word to conclude. I just want to say that even though climate change, I mean, these common and environmental challenges, or as we saw, a potential source of tension and a source of security issues, I think they can also be a source of extensive dialogue, as well as real ground for effective cooperation between us. And I think that this joint seminar today was a good proof of this, and a good step toward more cooperation. And I am convinced that we really need to keep it that way and to continue working all together as much as possible in the future. And this is, of course, something that we are willing to do. And I hope we can continue on this way in the near future. For the participants, of course, if you have any more questions that could not be answered, please shoot me an email, and I will try, or Julia an email. I will try to answer as soon as possible. I will write my email in the box, in the chat box. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you again, everybody. Hope you have a great day, and see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just jumping in to let you know that the slides of the Vice Admiral are available in the documents to distribute on the webinar. So you have a few seconds to download it now if you'd like.
Yes, and if it doesn't work, you can also shoot us an email, because some participants have indicated that the document might be too heavy for them. But yes, try downloading it right now. If that doesn't work, please shoot us an email.
Thank you.
Thank you again.